Well, Mr. Nelson, first of all, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day and organizing the entire day's events, making sure we were fed. We really appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Glad to do it.
Well, Mr. Nelson, and my name is Paul Ortiz. I'm director of the University of Florida Oral History Program. Mr. Nelson, I wonder if we could start by, if you could tell me where you were born, when you were born, and something about the community that you grew up in.
Okay, I was born right here in Monticello, Florida, on February the 17th in 1948, 69 years ago.
Very good.
In February, I just had a birthday, the 17th of February. And I was born in Roostertown, which is really not that far from here. And they call it Roostertown because that's where people had chickens and different kind of fowls and things of that nature. Mm-hmm. And of course, during those days were segregated days, and the railroad separated the white community from the black community. And so that was the dividing line. Mm-hmm. And the railroad ran right down. I lived on one side of the railroad, and then on the other side was where whites lived. So I was very close to that.
And that was at Roostertown?
Yes, in Roostertown.
Okay, in Jefferson County?
Yes. Matter of fact, it's right in this area, really right about a block up the street.
Okay. And Mr. Nelson, earlier, Mr. Barnhart and then Mr. Gallen, and of course they're from a generation earlier, talked about the really tough race relations here, the segregation. What was your experiences with that growing up?
Well, I experienced the last part of the real segregated part of Jefferson County, and it was extremely bad. We weren't allowed to, I actually attended Howard Academy High School, which is supposed to have been a little less than Jefferson County High School back then. And of course, African Americans were not allowed to go to Jefferson County High School. And so, as I heard some of the others, they came up through schools in the church. Well, I was fortunate enough to have to go through the first school that they had here in 1955, and that was on the north side of town. And later on, they built the school that was on the Roostertown side, right across the street from where I lived. And I could stay, the advantage I had back then is that school actually started at 8 o'clock, so I can get up at 7:30 and eat, and about 15 minutes to dress, and had 5 minutes, and I still could be in my class because I was within about 100 yards of the school.
Wow.
But there were total separate, the separate but equal process was really into play here. Mm-hmm. And we didn't go on that side of town, on the west side or east side. We always stayed on the south side because that's where the Howard Academy was. Now, white students would sometimes come over. They would just briefly come over, but we were not allowed to go in that. And back at that time, we still had, even at the courthouse, you had the black water fountains and you had the white water fountains, and you wouldn't dare drink out of the white water fountain.
Even though this was years after Brown v. Board,
yes,
but they still hadn't. Jefferson County, like most Florida counties, was not into the integration.
No, they were not. As a matter of fact, that didn't happen a little later on. I actually graduated from the segregated school in 1966. They still were segregated. And of course, the last class at my school, I understand, was 1970. And so the schools didn't really integrate until 1970.
Okay.
And one of the things that was interesting about that, and I hear them talking about choice, when they first came out with the process of start talking about integration in 1964, and they did a test, and they sent notices out to parents. What choice of school would you want your student to go to? Well, since my mother was a domestic person that worked in the house for most whites, she was afraid to wouldn't dare, because she probably had been submitted to some type of fear from the person that she worked with. You better not send that boy to the white school. And that's what happened. So most of our parents we want to stay at Howard Academy. But there were a few, like Johnny Webster, whose kids now are either medical doctors there, His oldest son is a doctor at NASA. That's Larry Webster, which I was in school. He's a PhD engineer with NASA in Houston. They actually challenged the system. And granted, back even in the 60s, I was one of those little radical people. I would never let my mother know about it. But we actually would challenge the system just to test to see what the feeling was. And one day, some of our kids left Howard Academy, and they actually marched to the administration building, which was at the White High School. That was a no-no, and our parents had a fit.
That's when you're in high school?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, there was a guy named Fred Sanders, who was very bold. He's dead now, died a couple of years ago. Fred was one of those 4.0 students, very brave, extremely knowledgeable. And he just had those leadership skills, and we who had the same kind of ambition would follow Fred, because Fred was an outstanding football player. I was an outstanding basketball player, so most of us had that similarity. And we we would come together and decided that we were going to march on the administration building. And of course, my mom wanted to beat the tarnation out of me when she found out about it.
Yeah, she didn't know until afterwards.
No, it was afterward. Yeah,
Wow.
And I was always involved with the civil rights people like John Dew, what we talked about, would come to town. I would always be at the tail end of those meetings. I would be at the mass meetings listening to people like John Dew, Kent Spriggs, an attorney out of Tallahassee who became the mayor. But I always hung out at those places, and I would always listen and become involved when I could. But that's the way it was. It was still a very heavy, segregated society. And one incident I can recall very vividly is that one day I was riding my bicycle here on Highway 19 going north, and some white kids came along, and they actually knocked me off the bicycle by throwing newspapers at me that was kind of rolled up. And I fell off the bike because I was trying to balance myself. And they didn't bother me, but they did those kind of devious type things.
Mr. Nelson, what year did you graduate from high school?
1966.
66. Okay, so when you were engaged in civil rights activities, you were do you remember the first time that you engaged in a protest or a march or?
Yes, we had as I said, we had the students marched on the administration building, and of course that was just a temporary situation. When there was some burnings that we had here where some of the leaders, adult leaders in the NAACP, and they had something back then called the Voters League. And of course, the Voters League was a process that was conducted by the Congress of Racial Equality. And they would come here to try to get folk registered to vote. And of course, what we would do, we would have marches from church to church, and we would sing those songs, "Don't Let Nobody Turn Me Around." And that would be the old hymnal that would, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around." And the ministers would lead it, and then I kind of fell in line with that because that always resonated with me, that I wanted to be a difference maker, and I guess that just became a part of me.
You mentioned John Dew. Who were some of your role models in terms of wanting to make a difference?
John Dew was one. I remember him very well. And again, when I think back now, I was a youngster. Normally, it was a pattern, a tradition, that you don't really sit in the middle of adults in their conversation. But for some reason, I always seemed to get close to those who were leading, like Attorney Dew, Kent Spriggs from Tallahassee, who was a civil rights attorney. And there was another fellow that was with the Congress of Racial Equality, Spivey Gordon. Spivey used to come here, and they will be talking about people needed to be registered to vote, because if you become registered to vote, then you had a voice. And I would listen to those folk, and their conversation resonated with me because I thought it was very important. And I guess that's how I became attached and to become more radicalized, as most people say it today. That's what really motivated me to say, well, maybe someday I can do something differently and be a difference maker.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So there's a few other questions I want to ask you at the next time we talk about those activities when you're in high school. But I wonder if we could fast forward to your military experiences. So as you're getting ready to kind of finish up high school, another, the civil rights movement is happening. Right. That's obviously the big national event. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, another big event is the Vietnam War.
Right.
When did you first become aware that the U.S. was involved in this big war?
Well, actually, what we had, my high school went to something differently for the first time than others had. We started getting televisions in. We were one of the first in this region to have civic lessons from televisions. And I thought that was fascinating. A lady by the name of G.B. Canny, who was very influential in the community and an educator, and she was able to get television in the classroom. And for the first time, rather than sitting down looking at books or reading from books or listening to an educator, they would turn the television on and you would see national events. And of course, at that time, it showed the civil rights movement, Dr. King. It showed the SNCC, all of those guys who were involved in marches, sit-ins, and all of that. And we saw a lot of, even from the standpoint of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Oh, right. We saw that on television. And that's when I knew right then that we were in trouble overall as a country. And then when they started talking about the Vietnam War, specifically after the Kent State event where the people were shot and killed, we saw all of those kind of things. And having that television showed a nationwide events that was going on not only in Florida but all over the United States. Mm-hmm. And by that time, I was a 10th grader, and when you became 11th grader, it was automatically that you had to register for the local board. Anytime that you got close to that, I think 6 months before you became 18, you had to register for the draft, and that created a list of available pool of people that could be drafted. Because I didn't have a desire to go in the military, but I was drafted.
Right. So, and you were drafted after you finished high school?
Yeah, what had happened, I had a scholarship to Alabama State University in music. I also had one to Savannah State, and I was pretty good in sports and basketball. And I selected the one to Alabama State because I was pretty gifted in music, which now I still do music pretty well. I've been involved in it about 56 years now. Still perform, still record. I've recorded also. But what happened was I got into Alabama State. What I call the thing that really reflected more on me, I had a Class 1A draft, which meant that I was the top level of eligibility to be drafted. And historical black colleges, HBCUs, which Alabama State was one of those, didn't have accreditation. Most black colleges were not accredited. So I began to think for myself then. I said, wait a minute, I could be drafted any moment. But to get around that, most people couldn't go to Canada. I had no way. We were too poor to go to Canada to dodge the draft. So my thing was to get into an accredited college, and therefore you could get a deferment, and you could finish school before you'd be eligible to be drafted. So what I did was, there was a business college in Jacksonville, American Business College. I came out of Alabama State, and I was enrolled in the American Business College in Jacksonville. So I got that deferment. It was a 2-year program. And when I finished that, I graduated magna cum laude, which is one of the highest levels. And immediately after that, 2 months after that, I was drafted.
Drafted, yeah.
Yes.
What year was that?
1968.
68, wow.
Height of the Vietnam War.
Where did you go to boot camp?
I went to Fort Benning.
Wow.
Fort Benning, hot, Sand Hill. The sand, they call it Sand Hill because as you were training and it was hot, the sand that got in the back of your shirt or your military uniform, it would burn your back. It was just that hot there.
Yeah, I did airborne training there.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, it was...
And I was signed up for airborne.
Okay.
Yeah, you could make an additional $55 a year back then.
Jump pay.
If you went airborne. So I signed up when I was at. But after I finished basic, I said, no, I don't want to jump out of any plane.
Yeah, you were smarter than I was, and I don't know how I ended up doing that, but yeah, they picked people, they showed us a movie that made it look glamorous and exciting, but then when I got there, I'm like, this isn't like the movie, and they're like, it's too late.
Oh, yes. Well, ironically, although I, after I finished basic, I was sent to Fort Lee, Virginia, for my advanced training. And it wasn't my choice, but I had signed up. I had been kind of coerced. I didn't want to go infantry because I knew that your best chance of getting killed was if you were in infantry. And so I thought about that. I was out of the 20-some thousand people that were actually drafted because, they had this big draft. That's when Lyndon Johnson was. And they needed a lot of troops in Vietnam, so they had this 200-some thousand, I believe, that were drafted in 1968. Well, I qualified. I was at the top of that large echelon. So they pulled us out, and we were given choices. Those that scored high, and I was one of those that scored high. And they gave me 6 different choices rather than infantry. So I ended up going to quartermaster in Fort Lee. And I graduated at the top of my class from my basic quartermaster class. And most folk who graduated at the top, they would remain at Fort Lee. But what they did with me, they said, okay, we're going to give you one other school, and that was aviation quartermaster, which meant that we were responsible for all the supplies for aircraft and things of that nature. And that's when I had my introduction to, and I'm saying to myself, I don't want to be affiliated with airplanes, but here I am. And so I went through aviation, S4 supply, and they call it stock control and accounting. That was the official name for it. And I graduated at the top of that class and just knew that I would be stationed at Fort Lee. And they sent the entire class to Vietnam. Wow. This was about latter part of April of 1968.
Wow.
When Vietnam Tet Offensive started in, I think, February.
Right.
So here it was 2 months later, I'm in the height of the Tet Offensive up in Da Nang.
What was that like going there?
Oh, man. I tell that story because it's ironic. We had 2 stops going from United States to Vietnam. First stop was Anchorage, Alaska. Cold, man. I didn't realize I'd never been subjected to cold weather because I trained at Fort Benning when it was hot. And then here we stop in Anchorage and all this snow and ice on the ground. But we were only there for just to refuel and everything. The next stop was Tokyo, Japan. Well, Tokyo, Japan was something like an exchange point between soldiers coming back and those going over. And we were there for a couple of hours, and I had a chance to talk with those who had experienced war. And I said, hey, man, what is it like? And these guys would come in and say, when you get to Vietnam, you come off that plane, you better stop crawling because they're going to be shooting at you and all that. And they had me so spooked up. And I really took it for real because I said, these guys have been in war. You could see the fatigue on some of them and that they were proud to be coming back to America. And I just took it for face value. I said, these guys know what they're talking about. When we first landed in Vietnam after we left Tokyo, Japan, it was Cam Ranh Bay. This was the personnel processing area for American troops. here I'm coming down the stairway of the plane. I get to the door and I'm trying to stay low, and these guys were at the end of the slide that's coming down from the plane. And one guy looked at me and said, "What's wrong with you?" I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Man, these guys are shooting at you and everything." And they started laughing. He said, "Oh, that's the joke they play on all new troops that's coming over." I said, "You can stand up. There's nobody shooting around here." And I thought about that. But that's just, it was a joke they played, but I took it seriously. But I actually processed through Cam Bay, and I was assigned to Ico, which is the northern part of Vietnam, where it was very, very bad. They call it Da Nang, it was Rocket City, because you got hit. We never did get hit during the daytime, but it was always at night, between 1 and 4 o'clock in the morning. I was assigned to the 245th Aviation Company, which we flew surveillance missions over the South China Sea, along the DMZ and all of that, because we had to provide intel information back to the Marine. We were affiliated with the 1st Marine Amphibious Force, and we provided military intelligence for the Commanding General for the 1st Marine Division, and then General Westmoreland, who was down in Saigon at MACV headquarters, which is Military Command Vietnam. Our information was provided to him, and then he provided it to field generals who were lesser ranked, like brigadier or major generals, 2-star. And of course, they fed that back up to field commanders, colonels, captains, and majors out in the field. The other thing that we did was we were stationed in Da Nang and Marble Mountain, which is a very historical place in Vietnam today. But we flew out of Marble Mountain because the F-4 Phantoms that the Air Force and Marines flew, the engine made so much noise until they could lock on. The anti-aircraft folk were the Viet Congs and the North Vietnamese. Up north, you had North Vietnamese Army, which were hardcore, very well-trained troops. Viet Cong normally would run if you got under heavy fire and everything. But North Vietnamese would fight to the death. You had to be prepared to really, either they're going to kill you or you kill them. But our airplane had an advantage. It was a T-53 Grumman made the aircraft, but it was a prop aircraft that had turboprops. So it had almost like a jet engine on it, but it was a turboprop. So we could have fly at about 250 knots, which is very fast, at a very low altitude. Our flights were anywhere from 750 to 1,000 feet. We were trying to get locations of where mass troops were so we can pipe that back to mechanized infantry units that were on the ground. As they do today, they have forward observers, but we could get in there, fly low. We never had a plane shot down where Phantoms were being shot down. You've heard a lot of pilots were captured and all of that. We'd never had one because they couldn't lock on us with radar. And we had this, the other thing, the sound would be about 100 kilometers behind. So we would be over and gone before you know that you've just been hearing when we are downrange. So we're gone, we've done our work just that fast. And our intel information were more effective than the Phantoms were.
Wow. Mr. Nelson, what was the morale like among the troops when you first arrived? And was there a change over time as the war kind of...
Ironically, you still had racial incidents in Vietnam. A lot of guys that are dead today because of racist type incident. I can remember a situation I was involved in. We got hit with about 6 to 8 rounds of 122 millimeter rockets, which was one of the most destructive rockets that the Vietnamese used. And it's designed to pin you down. The way that we respond to that, although we were pinned down, one person always had to come out of the underground bunker to be on top, because when you're being hit like that, it's similar to what artillery does. It kind of gets you in a position where you can have a column of troops to advance on you, and in most cases they're going to get you. But the Vietnamese used a group of people back then they called sappers, suicide bombers. People just hearing, in 1968, we knew about suicide bombers. These would be people that are indoctrinated, very similar to what the Japanese were doing with the kamikaze guys. These folk will be indoctrinated, and while they are firing 122 millimeter rockets at you, these guys are advancing through concertina wire, and they were skilled to cut through that razor-sharp concertina that wouldn't even get a scratch. We used to watch video. They showed us video, film of how skilled these guys were. So that's why you had to have a person on top of the bunker. We took at least 1 hour, each person. It's pitch dark, mosquitoes, hot. You're afraid because you knew that what's going to happen. If a sapper got you and they were so quiet, they would never fire a shot. They would take a knife and just slit your throat. But you had to be mindful enough and what I call in a battle mode, because even when they're coming through, you had to have that sixth sense. You had to know that you had to get them before they got to you, because what's going to happen if they got you, then they would roll themselves inside the underground bunker and just blow everybody up, including themselves. And that was my most fear in Vietnam. If I knew where the fire was coming from, pretty well I could fire back or return fire, and hopefully I could get them before they get me. But that sapper was my most fearful moment, because I knew that once you're up there, you can imagine 2 o'clock in the morning, and you're tired, you've been up all day at your job, you're trying to stay awake and alert, and you're going to nod off at times. And that was the most vulnerable moment. If you ever nodded off, you jeopardize those people that you were trying to protect, and you jeopardize yourself. So that would be a fearful moment.
Yeah. And even in the midst of that, there were racist incidents.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. As a matter of fact, there was one situation where we got hit, and the Marines we were kind of mixed up there. We took care of the rear area to make sure the aircraft were not really destroyed. If the sapper could get to the aircraft, that's what they wanted. They would get as many people as they could. But what would happen, the Marines would be the forward people that would be protecting the front, and we would protect the rear. And as the day would come after we got hit and the morning sunlight was coming out, there was this Marine who had a shotgun. That's what happened with sappers. You can have an automatic weapon, but you had 12-gauge shotguns, because you could kill more sappers at a close range because of the burst. Yeah. And so the Marines on the front line had 12-gauge shotguns. And I kept hearing this snap, snap. And I'm looking back this way, and this Marine, this white guy, was aiming at me. And immediately I ducked down behind my sandbags, because that's the only fortification that you have on there. And so once I realized what was going on, that he was trying to kill me, first instinct, you waste him. If he didn't get the chance to do it to you, you do it to him. And I guess because of the adrenaline and all of that kind of thing, I had my safety on my M16, and I kept just trying to fire it, because I just wanted to waste him, because I knew that he had missed me, but I was going to get him. And I never got to fire a shot off. The sergeant that was along there actually went out and went through the concertina. Got cut pretty bad, but he grabbed that guy and they had at it, and he pretty well almost demolished that guy. But that was a situation that I never forget, because here's a guy, we're trying to survive, we're looking out for one another, then he's trying to kill me. And I never did know who this guy was, but I know it had to be a racist situation. Yeah. And a lot of situations happen like that, where guys were killed who were even in battles, because I talked with a lot of guys. I was in the hospital. Guys had been wounded on the battlefield. I picked up a lot of guys who had been out in battle, lost half of their companies and everything, and giving them rides back to their base. And they would tell me that those are the experiences they have had. And so even it was very bad to my knowledge up in, and I don't know how it was in the central, in the Mekong Delta and down south, but up in the north end, it was extremely bad.
Because sometimes you'll hear people say, well, combat erases differences and causes people to work together, but it is not always that.
Well, what happened is the way you were trained in basic, that you forget about skin color and anything else. You become one unit. That's the kind of training and indoctrination that you had. But that didn't help. Somewhere down the line, I saw it in Germany. It was worse in Germany. As a matter of fact, when I came back after this was after Vietnam, I was assigned to Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah. Then 6 months later, I had orders to go to Germany. And what happened in Germany, I was in Hanau, Germany, which is up in the northern area, near about 30 miles from Frankfurt. There was a group in Hanau called the Black Baptists. It was similar to the Stokely Carmichael. They clenched fists. And then you had the Ku Klux Klan group up there, so they clashed. It was a constant clash between those two. Race relations were very bad. And we tried to deal with it because we were in aviation. You had artillery groups up there. You had armor, tanks battalions, and all of that. As a matter of fact, it was the first time I met our general. He went on to be retired General Julius Becton, which was retired as a 3-star general. Becton came in as a colonel, and that was the first time I really met a very high-ranking black officer. I saw some very low-level, like lieutenants and others, but I had never met a full-bird colonel. But Becton came up, was the commander for the 3rd Armor Division there at Hanau, and I remember when he came in. But it took a lot of, even one of my first sergeants in the 122nd Aviation was from Mississippi, and he and we didn't get along at all.
He was a white?
Yeah, he was white. And then again, it goes back to my involvement in high school with civil rights and everything, and I knew that he and I just didn't get along. But finally, he was replaced with a guy by the name of Rodriguez, who was the first sergeant. And that's where Rodriguez took a lot of time with me, and that's where he said, Nelson, you're a pretty good guy. You need to really start studying leadership. And he would meet with me, and I never forget, he was the one that encouraged me to run for Soldier of the Year for United States Army Europe.
Wow. Were you an NCO by then?
No, I was I was a Specialist 5, because you had to be in the sergeant ranks to be NCO, because normally you would have gone to NCO Academy, but because I came up with the specialist rank, I was in intelligence and S4, which was supply and other logistics, and never did get to that level where I got appointment to go to NCO school, although I was an E5. I went straight from a private E1, never was a 2 or 3 because of my intellect. I was promoted right from an E1 to a Specialist 4. So within 8 months in the Army, I was already a Specialist 4, because they used to call it instant guys back then. But even, by the time my 3 years was up, I was equivalent to a Specialist 6, but they never did give me the rank, which there was a such rank as a Spec 6. They call it Specialist 6. And I had advanced to that level and was promotable to that. That was on the top of the list. And so here it was. I had over a 3-year career in the military. a little over a year or something in rank as a specialist 5 because I went just straight from those levels like that.
Mr. Nelson, as you progressed through the ranks, and as you saw combat in Vietnam, and then transitioning to Germany, did your attitudes about the war change over time?
It didn't. Vietnam did something to me that it took a long time to get over. The incident where the guy was trying to kill me, it created a real combative attitude that I just didn't trust folk. And then when I came back, I had an experience at Savannah that really promoted that more. When I received orders after I got back, returned from Vietnam, and was assigned to Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah, I caught the bus from Tallahassee to Savannah. When I got off the bus, there was this lady on the ticket counter, white lady, and I was asking for my luggage. And I'm standing there. I said, my name is John Nelson. I have luggage back there. She acts as if I didn't exist. She was actually acting like that. And I kept saying, ma'am, can I get my luggage? And she never paid me any attention at all. So this old black cleanup lady, she came forth, and I never forget it. She said, son, you want your luggage? I said, yes, ma'am. And she went back and got my luggage, and I just thanked her. And that just disturbed me because I had spent a year in Vietnam. I saw all of the racism and all of the attitude among soldiers and knew that there were problems even in the United States when I got back, but I didn't realize it was that bad. And that kind of sparked I guess a hatred in me where I didn't care much for white folk at all. And we just didn't see eye to eye on from then all the way until I got out of the military.
So you returned to the States around 1970?
This was 1969. 69. I was back in the States about June of 69 because I left May of 1969. I went 68 and I had to do a year. And then I came back, as a matter of fact, and I took a month off they normally gave you a month to kind of regroup. So I came back to Monticello, and then I received orders to go to Savannah. And then when I reported to Savannah, I had this incident and everything. And so I was only in Savannah for 6 months, and then I received my orders to go to Germany. And then that's where Germany, I found out all of this other stuff was going on and all. And that never really cleared my memory and my concept of about what was going on. And you have to understand, I didn't have a desire to go in the military from the beginning. I knew I was very well, having gone to college, I was very well of what the movements were back then. The irony of it is I was at Fort Benning in basic training when Dr. King was killed.
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, and what happened was there was an incident that happened. They took all of the black soldiers and they locked us off in a barracks. They took all of the weapons and all the ammo and locked it down. And they put all of us in one building away from whites. And we stayed there for about 2 or 3 days before we couldn't even go outside. And I guess they were thinking about all of the turmoil because, you had riots and there were areas that were being burned and everything. And so they pretty well locked us off where we couldn't do anything. Though we had been trained, and when they trained you for Vietnam, through the training then, they had upgraded the training even in basic, where you heard nothing. It was a psychological thing that they really indoctrinated you. Even when you went up for bayonet training, kill, kill. When you would take the bayonet and put into the dummy, you had to, kill, kill. So that was the psychological process. Mm-hmm. So I guess they locked us down because they thought that we would actually utilize our skill that we had learned in basic against some of our counterparts because of the Dr. King's death and what was going on at that time. We had no TV. We knew at first that Dr. King had been killed because we saw it, and then they took the television out. And
what were your first thoughts when you learned?
Well, having that civil rights experience, I wanted to, like anybody else, I wanted to be a part of the nation's movement. Say, you kill our leader, and we're going to do something about it. But then they made certain that I guess, anybody that had that kind of attitude, they pretty well isolated you, and you could do anything. And it was a strange period back then. Mm-hmm. It took me a long time to get over that, and even to get back down to focusing on, especially going to Vietnam. As you know, Dr. King was extremely against Vietnam, and here I was in May of 1968, getting ready to go to Vietnam when King was killed prior to that, and they're going to Vietnam and knowing that kind of thing was happening. It took me a while to make the adjustments even after I got in Vietnam, and then I saw this situation where this guy was trying to kill me. Mm. And so that didn't help. Mm-hmm. But I was wise enough to maintain the status quo, to know that if I was going to survive, I had to make certain that I looked out for me and the guy that was next to me, regardless if he didn't like me and I didn't like him. I survived depending on we still looking out for one another. Mm-hmm. And I had another incident where a black guy who lost his mind from New Jersey, and he came after me with an M16. He had one night. I was writing a letter back home, and knowing that pretty shortly we're probably going to get hit because it was getting late. And this guy comes in the barracks. He had his M16. He was coming straight at me. I called him Fats, another black guy. And first thing I noticed was his eyes. And I said, this guy's not stable. And he just kept coming straight at me, knowing that he could have just moment notice, he would rip me apart because that weapon fires about 100 rounds a minute. And I had to think, fast thinking, what do you do? In a situation like that, you don't have time to think in a sense. It's instinct. So what I did was, instead of, had I moved fast, he probably would have shot and killed me. But everything was like a slow motion, and I recall it today. It was a slow motion situation where I said, hey, Fats, man, it's John, man. I didn't get very emotional, although I was extremely afraid. I said, that's your buddy John. Hey, remember me? And he was steady coming. And I had my eyes on the barrel, and I was looking at his eyes, kind of up and down, because I wanted to see what reaction. But he kept it level as he was coming toward me. So I knew no one is fast enough to get out of line of fire. If you're in a direct line, you're not going to move. Once that burst goes off, you're gone. And he walked up to me with the gun almost at my chest level. But I was able to bring this right arm up very easy, and when the tip of the barrel came to his hand, I just slightly pushed it to the side until I got it, and I suddenly snatched it from him, and then I pushed him on the bed. That was the only time I had some relief, knowing that I could have been dead. And so, but there were some other real adventurous times in Vietnam that I laugh about now, but
weren't funny back then.
Wasn't funny, and most 19 and 20 years old, because after that, I was about 20, 21, because most kids who got drafted were actually about 18. But at least I had 2 years in college, and basically I was a more mature mind. But I did some stupid things in Vietnam. I used to drive from my headquarters out to the direct support unit, which was about 25 miles away. I had to go through a Vietnamese village out into the rural area of Vietnam where I could have been killed easily. I used to stop in the middle of the village, get out of the truck with no weapon, go inside the village. I used to see some Vietnamese ladies, and I teased my neighbor, which is a Vietnamese that lived next to me over here. I said, and I thought Vietnamese ladies were very beautiful. And they are. They are some beautiful ladies. And I saw this young lady cross the street as I was coming from the DSU unit. And she went in the village, so I stopped, got out of the truck, and I followed her to her house. Went in and talked to the family. And the little kid came from under, I was in the room, came from up under a little hooch bed, because they had some like huts. And most Americans didn't have their money in their wallet in their pocket, because they could easily take a box cutter and they'll cut your pocket off, you never know it. So we kept our money in our socks. This little kid, I felt him fumbling around my socks, and I almost lost it because I knew right then I was dead. Because if that had been a Viet Cong, he could have easily killed me. I had no weapon. I'm in this village, one way out, and so I learned a lesson from that. I said I will never let it happen again. But those were times, and when you're young, 20, 21 years old, you don't think about death. You program yourself to the point where I have a 50-50 chance of dying. I'm going to try to utilize that 50% chance I have of living. So I'm going to do everything in my power to live, and I'm going to try to do everything to eliminate those chances of dying. And that's a concept that you adopt when you're in war. War is not pretty. I've been in hospitals where guys been shot through the neck. Some were burned with napalm. As a matter of fact, Vietnamese that had been captured had been hit by napalm, which is nothing but jelly gasoline, and his skin had been just peeled off from that. And we were on a plane flying down to Cam Bay to the recovery hospital. And you see those horrific type of situations and all. So again, I guess I had been over there about 9 months. I got used to it. You get to the point where you got to survive, Nelson. You're going to live. You just don't do anything stupid. You do everything to try to live. But now you have to be prepared. If you get in that situation where somebody's coming at you, you get them. Mm-hmm. You don't give them the chance to get you. And that's the survival mindset that you develop in war.
Right. Let's go ahead and call this a wrap now.
Okay.
And we will pick this back up.
Okay.
And this has been great. Thank you so much, Mr. Nelson. This is
yes.
amazing information.